Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to write an introductory paragraph and a conclusion paragraph for a timed rhetorical analysis essay, what is truly important when the clock is ticking. Just to give you guys a little bit of context, for my students, I have essentially two types of essays. The essays that they do outside of class where they have much more time, and then the essays that they do in class. Some of those are cold reads where they've never seen the prompt before, and other times it is a passage that we've talked about in class. And so because of that, these tips are for those situations where you only have a class period of roughly 40 to 45 minutes, just like on the AP Lang exam. These tips are not meant for those take-home assignments where you have a lot more time to write your essay. One of the most effective ways that I have found to teach students about writing an introductory paragraph is this inverted triangle, where you start broad and funnel down to specific. But I remind my students that in a time situation, you might not necessarily have a hook, or you might combine the context in the thesis, and that's totally okay. My students tell me that the hook is usually the hardest part for them, and that is because it is a universal truth or an overarching statement, and they just tell me that it's hard to come up with these under pressure. Now, the context can be the historical context or just a reference to the passage itself. This is when you're starting to establish the rhetorical situation. You can actually combine the context and thesis, or they can be two totally separate parts. The distinction is that the thesis is when you start to reference the choices that an author makes. So how do you actually come up with a hook? For me personally, when I'm writing, what I do is I ask myself, what is the subject of this passage, or what is the message? And I try to look for abstract concepts, things like justice or freedom, and then I try to make a universal truth out of that, or I tie it to the occasion. So for instance, if I was reading a eulogy, then the universal truth or topic or subject might be loss, but I could maybe make a generalized statement about eulogies or funerals, things like that. So the idea is to try to come up with this broader statement, but I tell my students, if you are taking the exam and you cannot come up with a hook, please do not sit there for 5 minutes with a blank page in front of you, or in the case of 2020, a blank screen. Just move on. You don't get a point for your hook. You get a point for your thesis. And I don't even necessarily fully believe that a student who doesn't have a hook can't get the sophistication point, because I believe that sophistication happens throughout the essay. And if a student has really strong body paragraphs and really good style, then I tend to forget the fact that they didn't have a hook in the first place. Another thing is, if you omit the hook initially and you have time at the end, maybe you could go back and rewrite it. So maybe leave a little bit of space if you're writing by hand, or if you're doing it on the computer, you can obviously just, go back to the beginning of your essay and type it in. But sometimes the hook is something that comes last. In fact, when I was in college, I used to just write a thesis first, and then I would write the rest of my essay, and I would come back and develop that intro. Not for every essay, but if I found myself being paralyzed, I would just get to my thesis and move on, because you really can't have an essay without a thesis, but you can definitely have an essay without a hook, especially if you're only given 40 minutes to write that essay. Subscribers tend to ask me, should I write an open thesis statement or a closed thesis statement? And I'm going to be really honest, you should write a defensible thesis statement. That is what the rubric says. Now, I teach my students a closed thesis statement, and then I offer some progressions that as they become more comfortable, they are welcome to use. But at the end of the day, I just want their thesis statement to be defensible. When I was in college, that's when I really started writing open thesis statements, but it was also because I was writing longer papers, not something that I had to do in 40 minutes. So figure out where you're comfortable. I'm going to show you guys a progression of thesis statements, and if there is one that you tend to like better, then I would say practice that for the exam. One of the things that I love about sentence frames is that it gives emerging writers a place to start. It's a guide for students to follow. Now, once you've become more comfortable with that, as you're developing your own authorial voice, you can absolutely adjust that sentence frame and make it your own. As long as you have a defensible thesis statement, it is absolutely okay to make modifications to fit your style. So I'm going to have you guys read this thesis statement along with me, and I want to see if you can figure out why this one might not be the clearest syntax. So as it's written, it says, in her passionate speech, Florence Kelley implores her audience to join with the men to end the unjust child labor laws by using examples, juxtaposition, and imagery. So this does reference choices. We do have the name of the speaker, things like that. So it is defensible. However, the syntax is not the best. I recommend that students put the choices first and then either the message or the purpose, because as it's written, it kind of sounds like Florence Kelley is telling them to use imagery to end child labor, when in actuality, she is using imagery to convince them to help her end child labor laws. So we want to just make sure that we're putting this in a clear order to make sure that we're not convoluting the message here. So this is the simplest of the thesis statement progressions I'm going to show you, and this offers a fix to what was on the previous slide. So I call this the noun form way, and that is because you're going to be using the noun form of the choices. So in this case, we've got exemplification, juxtaposition, and imagery. Notice that the choices are coming before the purpose. So purpose is usually indicated by to. Now we've got the verb form. So this is one step up. So I'm using the same exact ideas, it's just that now I'm using a verb instead of the noun. So instead of exemplification, it says provides examples. Instead of juxtaposition, it says contrasts. And instead of imagery, it says offers vivid descriptions. So we're still listing things here. We're keeping it in the present tense, but we're using verbs and we're adding in a bit more detail. The next progression is to add a doing so statement. So this is the exact same thesis. We're just adding another layer at the bottom. You can see it in blue. That is just to add a little bit more clarity to establish that rhetorical situation. Admittedly, even though I show my students the noun form of a thesis statement like this, I prefer the verb form. And so once my students have become comfortable with that, we talk about how to vary it. And so this is one of the variations that students can use. So it's still using verbs here. It's just a different syntax. And so if you're looking for a way to kind of customize it and make it your own, this might be another option for you to consider. In order to demonstrate an open thesis, I wanted to show you what it would look like if we did that hook context thesis model that I was talking about earlier. So the hook here is those who have a voice must use theirs to help those that don't. So just a universal truth. Then we go into the context. So I started with the historical context. The speech was from 1905, so just talking about the turn of the 20th century and how women didn't have the right to vote, so they didn't have the political voice that they desired. And then we actually talk about the specific speech and the audience, things like that. So we're funneling down. The thesis itself doesn't have what most people would consider very obvious choices, but they're still choices. If we think of a choice as something that the author does, then those verbs that I've highlighted there in blue are technically things that the author is doing. So an open thesis is just more open-ended. A lot of students ask, do I really need a conclusion paragraph? And quite frankly, this question doesn't come out of laziness. It comes out of the fact that they're worried about timing. And so here's what I would recommend you ask yourself instead. Do I have enough time for a conclusion? Let's say you've got 5 minutes left. You need to think about the paragraph that you're currently writing. If you're in the middle of a body paragraph, would writing that body paragraph and fully fleshing out those ideas help your evidence and commentary score? Chances are it probably would. And guys, that's 4 out of the 6 points on that rubric. You also need to remember that you need a defensible thesis. If you've already done this in your intro, you've earned that point. There is nothing on the rubric that says you absolutely need a conclusion. So if you do have enough time for a conclusion, what do you actually do? Well, think of it like a regular triangle, not the inverted triangle like the intro. So instead, you're going to go from specific to broad here. Here are some ideas of what you can possibly include in a conclusion paragraph. The first thing that you should probably think about is restating your thesis. Now, don't just carbon copy it from your intro. Make sure you vary your word choice. There's a couple reasons for this. First of all, your reader is going to remember what you wrote a few paragraphs prior, so varying your word choice can help. And also, if it wasn't defensible the first time, then if you rewrite it, it's possible it will be defensible the second time. So I'm not saying that you need a totally new thesis with new ideas, but rather you just need to reword it differently. Now, as far as new ideas go, can you bring them up in a conclusion paragraph? Yes. I don't know a lot of students who do this well, but I have seen it done a few times, so I figured I would include that in case that's a question students have. What I've seen more of is students actually looking at the historical context or the historical significance. Depending on the passage, this can work quite well. So let's say that you've got 4 minutes left on exam day, you're almost done with a body paragraph, but you know you're not going to be able to write a conclusion. What do you do? Well, some of the sentence frames or ideas that you could use in a conclusion can actually be used at the end of that last body paragraph to sort of round it out. So one of the sentence frames that I give my students sometimes starts with when considering, and they either finish that with some choices that they're referring to in the essay, or they do when considering and they talk about the message or the historical context. I've seen a lot of students use that sentence frame as the start of a conclusion paragraph, but I've also seen students work it into the end of a body paragraph if they were trying to conclude. Another thing to do would be to ask yourself a couple questions. If you're talking about the call to action anyway, maybe you could ask yourself, what happens if the audience listens to this message or to this call to action? What happens if they don't? So think about whatever point you're trying to make. How can you round out that point to logically conclude your essay? So I said that that sentence frame I was telling you guys about is one that some of my students use to lead into their conclusion, but I've also had students use it in their body paragraph to kind of round out that paragraph. So I want to show you guys what that looks like. I've written it here as if it was its own paragraph, but technically this could just be tacked on to that last body paragraph if needed. So here you see we've got that sentence frame of when considering, and we're also talking about the implications there toward the end. So I'm going to give you guys a second to pause the video if you want to read this. If not, just let the video play all the way through, because I'm going to show you another way to approach this without using those sentence frames. The previous slide was sort of my quick conclusion. That's how I would wrap up an essay if I was running out of time. But what do you do if you actually do have enough time? What if pacing's not your concern? Well, here is an example of what a sample conclusion paragraph might look like, particularly if you're trying to emphasize the rhetorical situation. So you'll notice that I'm actually saying a lot of the same ideas as the quick example. I'm just actually digging into it a little bit more. I know there is a lot of writing on the screen, so if you want to take a second to pause this and read it for your own sake, that is absolutely fine. Do so now. I know that timed writing situations can be very stressful for students, especially for rhetorical analysis, simply because of all the things you need to do in 40 to 45 minutes. So hopefully this video gave you guys a little bit of perspective and some useful tips. If it did, do me a huge favor, like this video and make sure you're subscribed. And until next time, guys, happy writing!